The sun was just starting to come up over the Texas ranch when Thomas Barclay woke up. He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling of his big bedroom. The light was coming through the window, burning everything gold and orange. But Thomas did not feel the warmth. He felt something else, that pain again. That sharp, terrible pain in his chest that made him catch his breath. He pressed his hand against his chest and waited. This always happened. The pain would come like a sudden storm, and then it would go away. He had learned not to fight it. Fighting it only made it worse. So he just laid there, waiting for the storm to pass, like he had done 100 times before. Thomas Barclay was the son of one of the richest ranching families in all of Texas. The Barclays owned more land than some countries. They owned 50,000 acres of beautiful Texas prairie. They had hundreds of horses. They had barns the size of small towns. They had money that seemed to have no end. But today, lying in his bed, Thomas would have traded it all just to breathe easy. The pain finally went away. Thomas sat up slowly. His hands were shaking. They were always shaking now. He looked at his hands like they belonged to someone else. These were the hands of a dying man. He knew it. Everyone else knew it too, even though nobody wanted to say the words out loud. 3 months. That is what the doctor had said. Maybe 4 if he was lucky. Thomas had heard those words in the doctor's office in San Antonio. The doctor was an old man with gray hair and sad eyes. He did not smile when he gave the news. He had looked at Thomas like he was looking at someone who was already dead. Thomas was 42 years old. He had lived his whole life on horseback, under the Texas sky, free and wild and strong. Now his body was broken. His heart did not work the way it should. The sickness was eating him from the inside. There was no medicine that could fix it. There was no doctor in Boston or New York or anywhere else who could save him. Thomas knew this because his sister Margaret had already sent letters to 10 different doctors. They all said the same thing. There was nothing they could do. Nobody talked about it directly. That was not the way people did things in Texas, but Thomas could feel it in the air. The ranch hands would stop talking when he walked past. The houseworkers would look at him with sad eyes. His sister would leave letters on his pillow about specialists and new treatments. His mother had cried when she thought he was not looking. His father had simply looked away, as if looking at his son was too painful. So Thomas had stopped riding. 6 months ago, he made that choice. The pain had gotten so bad that one morning, he could not even get into the saddle without tears running down his face. He fell off the horse. A grown man, falling off like a child. The ranch hands had run to help him up. Nobody said anything, but they all knew what it meant. Thomas Barclay, the best rider in Texas, the man who had won horse races and herding competitions, the man who had ridden through storms and floods and dangers, could not ride anymore. That is when he started dying, not just in his body, but in his spirit. The barn was his second home, but he could not go there anymore. It was too painful. Every morning, he would see the barn from his window, and he would remember what he had lost. His horse was waiting there. Storm. Storm was not just a horse. Storm was a legend. The Stallion was dark as midnight, black as the night sky, black as death itself. But across his face, he had a white blaze that looked exactly like lightning. When Storm ran, people would stop and stare. Children would point. Grown men would whisper about the beautiful horse. Storm had been born on the Barclay Ranch 15 years ago, and from the day he was born, he belonged to Thomas. No one else could ride Storm, not once in 8 years. Thomas had tried many times to let other people ride the Stallion, but Storm would not allow it. The horse would buck riders off. He would refuse to move. He would stand perfectly still and refuse to cooperate. Storm was not mean about it. He was just clear. This horse belonged to one man and one man only. That man was Thomas Barclay. For 8 years, they were never apart. Thomas and Storm had ridden across the entire ranch. They had crossed rivers when the water was so high that it could kill you. They had ridden through terrible storms where the lightning came so close that you could smell it burning the air. They had herded cattle across dangerous land. They had become one thing, not a man and a horse, but a team, a bond, something that no one could break. And then Thomas got sick. When Thomas stopped riding, Storm stopped living. The stallion would wait in the barn every single morning. The ranch hands would tell Thomas about it. Storm would stand at the barn door and neigh. Not a happy sound. A sound like crying. A sound like the horse was calling for his friend and could not understand why his friend would not come. Thomas would hear that sound from his bedroom. He would hear Storm calling him, and it would break his heart into smaller and smaller pieces. One morning, about 6 months after he stopped riding, Thomas had walked to the fence and looked at Storm from a distance. The horse had seen him and started to move toward him. But Thomas had turned away and walked back to the house. He could not bear it, could not bear the look in the horse's eyes, could not bear the understanding in those dark, knowing eyes. After that day, Thomas stopped even looking toward the barn. He would keep his eyes down. He would walk a different way if he could. He had lost his horse, and his horse had lost him. They were both dying now, just in different ways. The sun was higher now. Thomas got out of bed and dressed slowly. He moved like an old man, even though he was only 42. Everything hurt. His chest hurt. His heart hurt. His soul hurt worse than his body. He walked to the kitchen and sat at the big table. The house was quiet. Margaret was still sleeping. The servants had not started their morning work yet. Thomas was alone. He sat there and looked out the window toward the barn. And that is when everything changed. For the first time in 6 months, the pain in Thomas's chest was almost completely gone.
The night was very dark. Thomas did not sleep. He lay in his bed and felt something inside him that he had not felt in a long time. It was like hope. It was like life was coming back into his body. The pain was almost gone, almost completely gone. For the first time in 6 months, Thomas could breathe without feeling like a knife was cutting inside his chest. He sat up and looked out his window. The sky was still black. The stars were bright above the Texas ranch. Somewhere in the darkness, Storm was waiting in the barn. Thomas did not know why, but he felt very sure about something. Today was the day. Today was when everything would change. Thomas got out of bed at 4 o'clock in the morning. He dressed very quietly. He put on his old riding clothes, the ones he had not worn since he got sick. The clothes were loose now because he had lost so much weight. His body had become thin like a bird, but the clothes still smelled like the ranch. They smelled like dust and horses and the Texas wind. He walked down the stairs slowly. The house was completely silent. His sister Margaret was sleeping. The servants were sleeping. Nobody knew that Thomas was awake. Nobody knew what he was about to do. Thomas walked outside. The cool night air touched his face. It felt good. It felt like the world was welcoming him back. The stars were shining so bright. They lit the path toward the barn like a guide, like the sky itself was showing him where to go. The barn was big and dark. Thomas opened the barn door slowly. It made a small creaking sound, and in that moment, something magical happened. Storm knew. The stallion's head snapped toward the door. His eyes opened wide. Storm had been sleeping, but now he was completely awake. The horse's whole body became alert. His ears pointed forward. His muscles became tight like springs ready to jump. For 6 months, Storm had waited in this barn. Every single day, the horse had hoped that Thomas would come. Every morning, the stallion would wake up and listen for his master's footsteps. But they never came. Day after day after day, no footsteps, no voice, no gentle hand on his neck. Storm had given up hope, or at least he had tried to. But horses never truly give up. They wait. They remember. They know. Now, in the dark barn at 4 o'clock in the morning, Storm recognized his master. The horse made a sound, not a regular neigh. It was a sound of pure emotion. It was a sound like crying. It was a sound like joy and pain mixed together. It was the sound of a horse who had been waiting for 6 months to see the only person he had ever loved. Thomas could feel tears on his face. He did not know when he had started crying. His legs felt very weak. He walked toward the horse very slowly. "I know, boy," Thomas whispered. "I know you have been waiting." Storm walked toward Thomas. The stallion's hooves made soft sounds in the hay. The horse and the man stood face to face. They looked at each other. 8 years of riding together. 8 years of storms and rivers and danger. 8 years of trust so deep that it could never be broken. Thomas put his hands on Storm's face. The horse's skin was warm and smooth. Storm's eyes were dark and kind, and they held all the love in the world. This horse did not care that Thomas was sick. This horse did not care that Thomas was dying. This horse only cared about one thing, that his master had come back to him. "Can you do this?" Thomas asked the horse. He knew it was a crazy question. Horses could not understand words like that. But Storm seemed to understand anyway. The stallion pressed his head against Thomas's chest. It was like the horse was listening to his master's heartbeat. It was like the horse was saying, "Yes, I will do anything for you." Thomas walked to the saddle room. He moved carefully, slowly, with great love and respect. He picked up the leather saddle, the one that only Storm ever wore. The saddle was heavy, but Thomas carried it like it was made of gold. He walked back to Storm and placed the saddle on the stallion's back. Storm stood completely still. The horse did not move 1 inch. It was like Storm understood that this moment was very important. This was not a regular ride. This was something much bigger than that. Thomas put the saddle blanket down first, then the saddle. His hands moved slowly and carefully. He had done this 1,000 times before, but this time was different. This time, it felt like a ceremony. It felt like something sacred and holy. He tightened the saddle straps. One by one, each strap was secure. Storm did not move. The horse just stood there and watched his master work, watching him like it was the most important thing in the world. Thomas put the bridle on Storm. The horse opened his mouth and accepted it gently. A horse that belongs to anyone can be ridden, but a horse that truly loves his master, that horse becomes one with his rider. That horse becomes part of something bigger. Storm was that kind of horse. When the saddle was completely ready, Thomas stood back and looked at his horse. Storm was beautiful. The black hair shined like silk even in the darkness of the barn. The white lightning blaze on his face seemed to glow. This horse was strong and powerful and perfect. "This is our last ride," Thomas said to the horse. He did not know if those words were true, but he felt them in his heart. "This is for both of us, Storm. This is our goodbye to everything we have known." Storm made a small sound. It was like the horse was saying, "I understand. I am ready. I will take you anywhere you want to go." Thomas took a deep breath. The pain in his chest was almost completely gone now. He had been given a gift. A morning with no pain. A morning to ride his horse one last time. A morning to be free again. He walked Storm toward the barn door. The sky outside was starting to turn gray at the edges. The sun was still sleeping, but it was getting ready to wake up. It was getting ready to paint the sky with orange and pink and gold. Thomas looked at the gates of the ranch in the distance. Those gates led to the whole world. Beyond them was all the land that the Barclay family owned. Thousands and thousands of acres of wild Texas prairie. He could go anywhere, but there was only one place that mattered. The cliff. The place where the sky touched the earth. The place where you could see forever. "Let's go, Storm," Thomas whispered. And the horse, who had been waiting for 6 months to hear those words, stepped forward into the new day. They rode like the wind had memory. Thomas sat deep in the saddle and pressed his body against Storm's neck. He could feel the horse's heart beating. It was strong and fast and powerful. Beat after beat after beat. The stallion's legs moved beneath him like thunder made into motion, like lightning made into action, like the sky itself had come down to earth and was running. The ranch gates were far behind them now. They had passed through them at sunrise. The sun was just starting to paint the sky orange and pink and gold. But Thomas and Storm did not slow down. They ran faster and faster into the new day. The Texas prairie opened before them like a dream. Golden grass stretched from one side of the world to the other. The land was wild and free and beautiful. There were no roads out here, no fences, no walls. Just the endless earth and sky and the beat of one horse's hooves against the ground. 20 miles. That was the distance to the cliff. Thomas had ridden it 100 times in his life. It would take about 2 hours if you rode at normal speed. But this was not a normal ride. This was different. Storm ran like he had been waiting his whole life for this moment. The wind pushed against Thomas's face. It was cold and clean, and it made his eyes water. But he did not care. He felt alive. For the first time in 6 months, he felt truly alive. The pain was gone. His lungs were working. His heart was beating strong and sure. This was a gift from God or the universe or from whatever power had given him this one perfect morning. They raced across arroyos, dry riverbeds that cut deep into the earth. Storm jumped them easily like they were nothing. The horse's legs stretched long and powerful. For a moment, they flew through the air. For a moment, man and horse were flying across the Texas landscape with nothing between them and heaven. They climbed rocky hills where the ground was hard and sharp. Storm's hooves found the path without hesitation. The stallion had run this land with Thomas for 8 years. These paths were written into the horse's memory. Storm could run them even in the dark. Storm could run them even in his sleep. But back at the ranch, people were starting to notice things. Margaret woke up and looked for her brother. His bed was empty. The sheets were still warm, which meant he had left not long ago. She stood at his window and looked toward the barn. The barn door was open. Her heart began to beat very fast. She knew what this meant. She knew what Thomas had done. "Where is Thomas?" she called to the ranch hands. Her voice was shaking. One of the men, a tall cowboy named Jack, ran to the barn. He came back a few moments later and shook his head. "Storm is gone, Miss Margaret. The saddle is gone." He took the horse. Margaret's face became very white. She knew about the pain. She knew about the doctors in San Antonio. She had read the letters. She knew about the 3 months. Maybe 4. "Get the horses," she said quietly. "Get every man who can ride. We have to find him." But even as she said the words, she was not sure what they would do if they found Thomas. What could she do? Hold him? Force him back? Her brother was dying. He was choosing his own way to say goodbye. Still, they had to try. Margaret rode faster than she had ever ridden before. Behind her were 15 ranch hands. 15 men on fast horses, racing across the prairie, trying to catch a man who had made his choice and a horse who understood exactly what his master needed. But they were far behind. Thomas and Storm were already halfway to the cliff. The sun was higher now. The heat of the day was starting to build. The ground beneath them became harder. They were entering the rocky area where the land started to change, where the prairie began to become something more dangerous, something wilder. Thomas's breathing was getting harder now. He could feel the sickness trying to come back. The pain in his chest was starting to whisper again, like a shadow that was waiting for him. But he pushed it away. He would not give up. Not now. Not when they were so close. He pressed his face against Storm's neck and whispered to the horse, "Keep going, boy. We're almost there. Just a little bit more." Storm seemed to understand. The horse's pace did not slow. If anything, the stallion ran faster. It was like the horse could feel what his master was feeling. It was like they were one being, one soul split between 2 bodies. What Thomas needed, Storm knew. What Storm wanted to do, Thomas understood. There were no words between them. Words were not necessary. This communication was deeper than words. This was the language of trust, the language of love, the language that only happens between a horse and a man when they have lived together for 8 years and understood each other perfectly. The dust rose up behind them like a ghost made of red and orange and golden Texas earth. The dust told the story of their passing. It showed where they had been, like a trail written in the sky itself. Then Thomas saw it, the cliff. It appeared on the horizon like a promise, like a dream made into stone. That great red ridge rising up against the sky. That ancient rock that had stood there for thousands of years and would stand there for thousands of years more. The place where the earth stopped and the sky began. Thomas pulled back slightly on the reins, and Storm began to slow down. The horse's breathing was heavy now. The stallion was not a young horse anymore. He was 15 years old, but he had run like he was 5. He had run with all the power and strength and love that a horse could give. They came to stop about 50 yards from the cliff's edge. Behind them, still far away, they could see dust. The ranch hand were coming. They were riding as fast as they could, but they would not be in time for what was about to happen. Thomas dismounted slowly from the saddle. He stood on the ground and looked out toward the horizon. The cliff stretched away in both directions. Down below, the world dropped away into a canyon so deep that you could not see the bottom. It was like looking into forever. It was like looking into the end of the world, but it was beautiful. Thomas turned back to Storm and put his hands on the horse's face. He looked into those dark eyes, those kind eyes, those eyes that had loved him every single day for 8 years. "You did it, boy," Thomas whispered. "You brought me here. You brought me to the sky." Storm pressed his head against his master's chest one last time, and Thomas knew that whatever came next, it would be okay, because he had loved this horse, and this horse had loved him back. That was enough. That was everything. The cliff was real now. Not a dream, not a hope. Real. Thomas stood at the edge of the world. Behind him was everything he had known his whole life. The ranch, the family, the money, the land, the life he had been born into. 50,000 acres of Texas belonging to the Barclay family. But all of that belonged to a man who was not sick, a man who could ride, a man who could live. That man was gone. The wind blew hard at the top of the cliff. It pushed against Thomas like invisible hands. It wanted to push him forward, or maybe it wanted to hold him back. Thomas could not tell which. Below him was the canyon. It was so deep that Thomas could not see the bottom. The walls of the canyon were red and brown and gold. They looked like they had been painted by God himself. They looked ancient and powerful and eternal. Thomas had been here before many times, but he had never stood this close to the edge alone. He had never felt this moment so deeply. Storm stood behind him. The horse was breathing hard from the long ride. Steam was coming off the stallion's body in the hot Texas air, but Storm did not move. The horse did not come forward to push Thomas away, did not try to save him. Storm just stood there, quiet and faithful and true. And then they came. The ranch hands appeared on the horizon first. Thomas could see them in the distance. 15 men on horses, riding as fast as they could. But they were still far away. They would not arrive in time. Then Margaret came into view. She had ridden ahead of the others. Her horse was nearly dead from running so hard. Margaret's face was white with fear and pain and understanding. She could see her brother standing at the edge of the cliff. She could see the truth in every part of his body, every part of his posture, every part of the way he was standing. She knew what he was about to do. Margaret pulled her horse to a stop about 50 yards away. She could not go closer. Something in her knew that if she went closer, Thomas would jump. He would jump to save her from having to watch it. He was that kind of man. "Thomas, no," she called out. Her voice was very small in the wind. It sounded far away, even though she was not that far. The wind took her words and scattered them like dust. Thomas turned to look at his sister. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. And in that moment, they said everything that needed to be said. Margaret saw in her brother's eyes that he was not afraid anymore. She saw that he was at peace. She saw that he had made his choice. She saw that this was not the end of his suffering. This was the end of his pain. This was freedom. "I love you," Margaret said. Her voice broke into pieces. Thomas nodded. He put his hand over his heart. The ranch hands were getting closer now. Thomas could hear the sound of their hooves, could hear their shouts calling his name. But it did not matter. They were still too far away. They would not stop what was about to happen. Thomas turned back toward the cliff. He looked out at the canyon. He looked at the sky. He looked at everything. The vast Texas landscape stretching out forever in every direction. The land he had loved his whole life. The land his family owned. The land that owned his heart. He thought about his mother, about his father, about all the people who loved him and wanted him to live. But he also knew the truth. He was dying. The sickness was eating him from the inside. There was no cure. There was no hope. There was only pain and slower death. He had been given one gift. One morning without pain. One morning to ride his horse one last time. One morning to be free. He would not waste it. Thomas looked back at Storm one final time. The horse's dark eyes were watching him, watching every move, waiting for what would happen next. Storm was not sad. The horse was not afraid. Storm was just there, just present, just loyal to the very end. "Thank you," Thomas whispered to the horse. "Thank you for bringing me here. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for being the only true friend I ever had." Storm made a small sound. Not a neigh, not a cry, just a soft sound like understanding. Thomas put his hand on Storm's face one final time. He felt the warmth of the horse. He felt the strength. He felt the love that lived in this animal that had meant everything to him. Then he stepped back. He stepped back slowly, like he was doing a dance, like he was moving through water, like every step took all the strength he had left in his body. Storm backed away too. The horse seemed to understand, seemed to know what his master wanted. The stallion moved backward slowly, never taking his eyes off Thomas. The ranch hands were very close now. Thomas could hear them shouting his name. "Thomas! Thomas! Stop! Please!" Margaret was crying. Her hands were over her mouth. But Thomas was not looking at them anymore. He was looking at the sky. He was looking at the land. He was looking at everything he had ever loved his life. And he was saying goodbye. The wind blew harder. Thomas Barclay stood at the very edge of the cliff. His body was thin and broken and dying. His heart was broken too, not from sadness but from love so deep that it had broken him open. He had lived 42 years. He had loved one horse with his whole heart, and now he was going to fly. Thomas took one more breath of Texas air, one more breath of freedom, one more breath of wind and sky and light. And then he stepped forward. He did not jump. He did not throw himself. He simply stepped forward like he was stepping into a new room, like he was stepping into the next part of his life, like he was stepping toward the only peace he would ever know. For one moment, his body flew through the air. For one moment, he was flying like a bird. For one moment, he was truly free. The ranch hand shouted. Margaret screamed. The wind carried the sound away. Storm stood at the cliff's edge and watched his master fall. The horse did not move, did not cry, did not panic. The stallion just stood there and watched the man he had loved disappear into the sky, disappear into the canyon, disappear into whatever comes after. And when Thomas was gone, Storm turned away from the cliff. The horse looked at Margaret. The horse looked at the ranch hands. The horse looked at the sky. And then Storm began to walk back toward the ranch. But the horse was different now. Something had changed inside him in that moment. Something had broken and healed and broken again all at the same time. Storm was no longer the horse who had a master. Storm was now the horse who carried a memory. And that memory would change everything. Storm did not move for 3 days. The stallion stood at the cliff's edge and looked out toward the canyon, toward the place where Thomas had fallen, toward the sky where his master had disappeared. The ranch hands did not know what to do. Should they force the horse to leave? Should they let him stand there? Should they do something? They did nothing. They stood far away and watched. They watched a horse grieve. They watched an animal that understood something deeper than any person could understand. They watched loyalty that was so strong and so real and so true that it made them cry. Margaret sat on her horse and cried too. She cried for her brother. She cried for his suffering. She cried for his courage. She cried for the way he had chosen to say goodbye. And she cried for the horse that had loved him more than any human had ever loved anyone. On the first day, the ranch hands tried to lead Storm away from the cliff. The horse would not move. They pulled on his reins. Storm stood firm. They pushed on his side. The stallion did not budge. It was like the horse had become part of the earth. It was like Storm was glued to this spot by grief and love and memory. On the second day, they stopped trying. They brought water and hay. Storm would not drink the water, would not eat the hay. The horse just stood there, looking out toward the horizon, toward the place where his master was. On the third day, something changed. The sun was coming up. The sky was turning orange and pink and gold, just like it had been on the morning when Thomas and Storm had ridden away together. And in that moment, Storm seemed to wake up from a dream. The horse turned away from the cliff. He looked at the ranch hands. He looked at Margaret. He looked at the land stretching out before him. And then, slowly and carefully, Storm began to walk back toward the ranch. The stallion moved like a ghost. like he was carrying something very heavy inside him, like he was carrying the memory of everything that had happened. Storm did not run, did not rush, just walked one step after another back toward the place where he had lived his whole life. But Storm was different now. Something inside the horse had changed. Something had been broken and could never be fixed. Something had been lost that could never be found. When Storm arrived back at the ranch, the hands wanted to put him back in the barn, but the horse refused. Storm walked to the middle of the big pasture and stood there. Day after day, the stallion stood in that same spot, looking toward the cliff. The ranch hands stopped trying to ride him. No one dared. This was not a horse anymore. This was a memorial. This was a statue made of flesh and blood and heartbreak. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Years began to pass. Storm never left that pasture, never ran with the other horses, never played or ate much or seemed to feel joy about anything. The stallion was alive, but only barely. His body was still strong. He was a young horse, only 15 years old, but his spirit had died on that cliff. Margaret came to visit him every single day. She would stand at the fence and look at the horse. She would sometimes cry. Sometimes she would just stand in silence. And Storm would look back at her with those dark eyes that had seen everything. Those eyes that had witnessed the most important moment of their lives. "You did the right thing," Margaret would whisper to the horse. "You gave him what he needed. You were loyal to the end." Storm would not respond. The horse would just keep looking toward the cliff, toward the memory, toward the past that he could never escape. The story started to spread across Texas. It started with the ranch hands telling their friends. Then their friends told other people. Then people in town heard about it. A dying man, a horse that loved him, a final ride, a moment at the cliff that changed everything. But the story did not become famous as a sad story. It became famous as a story about loyalty, a story about love, a story about sacrifice, a story about what it means to truly belong to someone, and to show that belonging even when it hurts the most. Other ranchers came to the Barclay ranch to see Storm. They would stand at the fence and look at the horse. They would take off their hats and be quiet. They would think about the meaning of what they were seeing. A horse had loved a man so much that he had carried him toward death. Not fighting it, not trying to stop it, just accepting it and being there for every moment. That was not a story about sadness. That was a story about the truest kind of love. 5 years passed, then 7, then 10. Storm was still alive, but now the stallion was getting old. His body was becoming weaker. His mane was turning gray, but he still stood in the same place in the pasture, still looked toward the cliff, still carried the memory of Thomas inside him. Margaret never stopped coming to visit. She would bring apples and carrots. Storm would eat them slowly, gently, like he was thinking of something far away. The horse and the woman had become friends over the years. They had become the only 2 living things that shared the memory of Thomas Barclay. Then one morning, Storm did not get up. The horse had laid down in the grass. His breathing was very slow, very shallow. Margaret called the ranch hands, and they came with her. They all stood around Storm and watched. The stallion looked at Margaret one final time, and in that look was everything. It was goodbye. It was love. It was the memory of 8 years of riding together. It was the memory of that final morning. It was the memory of a man who had needed his help. Storm closed his eyes, and then he was gone. The ranch buried Storm where he had stood for so many years in that pasture. They placed rocks around the grave in a circle. They planted a tree there, an oak tree that would grow strong and tall, just like the horse had been strong and tall. Years later, the tree was very big. Visitors would come to the ranch just to see it. They would sit under the branches and think about the story of Thomas and Storm. The story of a man and a horse who had loved each other so much that death could not break the bond between them. Historians who wrote about the Barclay family did not begin with the land or the money. They began with a footnote about Thomas and Storm, a footnote that became a poem that became a legend that became something that no one would ever forget. The poem said, "A horse loved a man so much, he carried him toward the sky. When the man fell, the horse stood witness. The horse did not turn away. The horse did not run. The horse stood at the edge of everything and remembered." That is not a sad story. That is the truest kind of love. That is loyalty made eternal. That is a horse who became a legend. That is a moment that will never be forgotten. Even the weakest moment had become legendary, because a horse had remembered when everyone else forgot, and a man had found freedom, and love had proven stronger than death itself.